Hi everybody, we're here with Dr. Harper Keenan. So my first question is, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but in the current moment we're in with climate change and a bunch of things and crises going on around the world, why do you think there's such a focus on trans people and especially trans youth and trans kids?
It's a great question. I think it's important to look at the contexts where that is happening, where the focus becomes so acutely on trans children in particular. So in the US context where I'm from, we see that coming in particular from states like Florida. And Florida is a place that is going to be directly impacted by climate chaos in the very near future. They're already experiencing flooding and hurricanes, enormous property damage. And trans children are an absolutely tiny minority of people that become a convenient scapegoat to distract from things like the devastation of climate change in a place like Florida. And then we see that rhetoric spreading around the world. And many right-wing politicians are using that as a convenient distraction from, again, issues like climate change that are very immediately impacting people's everyday lives.
And how do you think that works in education? Because in education, it's also, I don't know if you would consider it a distraction, or why does it become such a taboo to talk about in schools? And it's a taboo and it's also a topic. Right, so we need to talk about gender in schools. That's true for the US and it's true for Canada, and it's also true for here, right? And in Chile, there are now a lot, what the gender discussion has turned into in Chile is a bunch of protocols, right? And so we have protocols for research, we also have protocols for schools and who gets to use what bathroom and how you get to decide which bathroom you can use. So I don't know if my question is why, but like, how is it we're here?
I think it's a difficult question to answer. But if I were to hypothesize, I think that children, we have actual children, and then we have children as a social symbol. And I think in these kinds of political conversations about trans childhood, children become a political symbol about how people who are vulnerable relate to systems of power. Children are made to symbolize vulnerability, innocence, things that are sort of out of control, and adults are made to symbolize control. And so really these conversations kind of come down to how adulthood is structured in relation to childhood. And so, for example, with the discourse around trans children and childhood, in adult-driven conversations about this, we see the focus turn heavily to administrative management as the solution to the challenges that trans youth might face. So we see policies that are often very well-intentioned that say things like children need to have access to bathrooms that reflect their gender, or they need to be able to play on sports teams that reflect their self-determined gender. There's a lot of rules and regulations, but a lot of those policies do very little to actually put power in the hands of children. They maintain the administrative regulation of childhood. They don't actually engage with children's own demands or the ways that children act in ways that might be puzzling to us as adults sometimes. The ways that children are complicated. These policies don't fully engage with that. And instead we respond to the complexity of who children are with more protocols and rules and regulations that manage children, including trans children. So trans children become another object of management within bureaucratic systems like schools. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And so I wanted to follow up that question with fear and the fear around children. So there is this discourse around protecting kids and protecting children. And we can all agree that that's important. But there's a tension with people who are against sexual education in schools, who use that same discourse of protection for the same thing like sports or bathrooms, as a way to protect girls, or especially protect girls, right? Girlhood as a thing that needs protecting. And so I'm wondering about, in Chile, there is what you would consider a more open discourse around gender that still uses the fear around what could happen to children and the discourse of protection to limit what can be researched and studied and understood about gender education and childhood. And so I'm wondering about that tension, right, between gender studies seen as something dangerous, and this discourse of protecting children, and then sexual education in schools as something that should be outside of schools in order to protect children. Just the confluence of those three things.
Mm-hmm. I think, I'll kind of go back to what I said after the talk, but, first, I think it's really interesting that trans children have become the object of gender studies in relation to childhood. Mm-hmm. That trans children become the site of where gender is happening, instead of studying much more deeply the ways that compulsory heterosexuality and cisgenderism is socialized all throughout children's childhood. And the story that I told this morning was that, for example, my child on his first day of life, the nurses were talking about how he was flirting with them. He's 1 day old. Of course he's not flirting. But that's a way that they're sort of projecting a heterosexuality onto him when he is literally hours old. So I think it's important, in addition to our efforts to support trans children, to pay really careful attention to how all children are socialized into compulsory gender identities and the general regulation of gender. And then the second thing that I want to say is that I think trans and queer social movements have always been deeply concerned with the safety of children, because so many queer and trans people grow up in homes that are not safe for them. And so it has always been of utmost concern to cultivate safe spaces for children. And one of the ways that queer and trans social movements have done that is by trying to support the agency and self-determination of children. Because of course, no child should ever have to defend themselves from harm or predation or danger. But the reality is that they do find themselves in those situations. And in those situations, some of the best forms of protection are a very assertive and agentic child. And I think that our education system needs to support those qualities in children instead of this constant rhetoric of protecting them through the management of adults. And in that way, it's very important that we think about education that supports children's self-determination instead of trying to control and manage who they are and who they can become.
I want to ask you a research question, because I noticed that you're super careful with the language that you use and the way you talk about children, and just language in general, the way you addressed us in the talk that we were in. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about language and research and talking about these subjects of sexuality and especially children, right? And the ways in which we talk about children.
Language is such a challenge in doing research around childhood and in doing research with actual children, because the reality is that children speak differently than adults. And I think that historically, research about children has come from an adult perspective. It has very rarely engaged with actual children and studied their language or engaged with their language of how they construct their own self-concept or their way of understanding the world. In part because children say things that are weird. They say things that are surprising to us. They say things that adults don't necessarily understand right away. And often adults respond to that by trying to manage them or trying to clarify what they're saying. And so very little research has actually engaged in meaningful dialogue with children or talked with them about how they understand the world. And so I hope I'm answering your question, but the reason why I do the work I do is because I think in so many dialogues about social justice in education, we say things like, nothing about us without us. Mm-hmm. But we almost never say that about children. And I don't believe I can make claims about children and childhood without actually talking to them. And even when I do, I have to be very careful about, over-interpreting what children say. I can only guess. And so I try to be clear about that, and I try to be descriptive rather than overly interpretive.
You said something in your talk about the ways in which teachers decide when to talk about things, right? And so in the formal education teaching space, in class, that's when, because they can manage the conversation. And you talked about the situation where one girl was teasing a boy about his long hair, and the teacher not paying attention to that moment. And it also made me think about the ways in which we do teacher education and how we treat students of education and what we think is important for them to listen to and understand. And so I don't actually know if you work with people who are studying to be teachers, because I see that too, right? And where teacher educators decide what teachers need to know or be able to do, and very little space, at least here, for them developing their own thinking and their own ways of. And so I feel like it reproduces then into the ways in which they talk to children and which they think that they can handle. And so I don't know if you can speak to teacher education specifically also in the ways in which we teach them how to address difficult subjects. Mm.
Yeah, I think that referring back to what I said earlier about how adulthood is structured in relation to childhood, there's a parallel with how teaching is constructed in relation to being a student. So the teacher is always an adult, the student is always a child. So even when you're teaching adults, they are often treated like children. And so when we are working with adults in teacher education, which I do too, I think we too often treat them in the way that we treat children, which is also not okay with children. But it is often a very disempowering experience. It's often heavily managed by the instructor. And what that does not do is to support those teachers in developing the skills to respond to what I refer to as unmanageable moments as they happen. Very few teachers go into classrooms well prepared for how to respond to that. And I think that we can see evidence of that in the kinds of educational systems that we witness all over the world. And so I think that it's very important that we think about what anti-authoritarian education actually looks like in practice. And I think a very important way to begin thinking about that is to think about how childhood is structured in relation to adulthood, and childhood as a political category. So how do we politically understand children? And how does that then shape the way that we relate to pre-service teachers? Because I think we're doing both teachers and children a real disservice by not inviting them into the most complex conversations that shape society. Mm-hmm. I mean, children are asking questions every day in classrooms, and so often their teachers are avoiding them. And if you go through school for 13 years or more, you learn that those questions are not important and the problems don't get addressed. So this is urgent. We see plenty of evidence around the world for how urgent it is. And I think it's something that we need to explore right away.
What do you think about like the replication from trans youth and trans children of patriarchal norms, and possibly ideas of how to work with that, address that?
That's a great question. I don't see a lot of evidence of that with the specific children that I work with. I think in part because they are so young and somewhat less steeped in some of those norms. We're talking about kids that are 4 to 6 years old. That said, I do witness that in sort of activist circles with young people. And I think that the dialogue around that, like how trans people sometimes reproduce patriarchal structures, is also not something that most educators are well prepared to take on. The conversation is very focused on inclusion and how to make sure that trans people access basic safety, which is a shame because there's a whole host of complex in-group issues within trans communities that are just completely neglected within school contexts. And that is, I think, true of many minoritized groups in society and their experience of public education. But I think it's really important. I think it's very important for me as, for example, a white transmasculine scholar to be very mindful of my own positionality and how that shapes the work that I do. And I hope the same thing for young trans people, that they are thinking about how their construction of themselves, even if that construction is self-determined, shapes their interactions with others and how to resist the reproduction of the same norms that have been used to oppress gender minoritized people forever. So I think that's a really important question, and one that is fully neglected by the current state of the conversation around gender and education.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure to have you today. Thank you for coming to Chile.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you to the audience. I hope this was an interesting conversation and that you have a lot of questions for working around these issues in your own practice and in your own life.